Have I become less of a hater? We'll see. Hello! Today we are rereading Normal People by Sally Rooney. I did not like Normal People when I first read it, and I'll get into the reasons why I didn't like Normal People, but as of late I've been thinking about Normal People. I read it only once, but the story keeps coming back to me and I keep thinking about the themes, and I feel like it's a sign to reread it because it's been a number of years and I've changed. The book hasn't changed, but I've changed. My interpretation of it will probably change. I think I've just also become like less of a hater. Like, that's my personal journey. I also think after reading Intermezzo and seeing kind of the journey that Sally Rooney has taken with her writing, it is interesting to go back and reread her earlier work. I also haven't watched the Hulu adaptation, so I think I'm gonna reread this and then watch the adaptation. If you are here hoping for like a hate parade on this book, it's probably not gonna happen. I'm just letting you know now. But I will tell you what I didn't like about it the first time that I read it. If you don't know what Normal People is about, it's about Connell and Marianne. They grew up in the same town. They have this secret relationship because Connell is really embarrassed of Marianne because she's not popular in school. She has a rich family and her family actually employs Connell's mom to clean their house. I did not love Connell. I really could not get over how he treated Marianne in the beginning, like being so ashamed of her. And I feel like in a later part of the story, he didn't really redeem himself in my eyes, at least enough for me to like really like him and root for him. Another thing I did not enjoy was the depiction of kink in the book. It is implied that Marianne enjoys having sex in a certain way due to like the childhood abuse that she suffers growing up, which like I feel like is such like an outdated and stigmatized way of thinking about kink. But when I revisit it, I'm gonna see if that's still how I interpret it. Another thing I didn't like about Marianne's character, she basically has an eating disorder in the book. This is not just a thing with Normal People. I think Sally Rooney does that in, I don't know if it's like all her books, but she also does it in Conversations with Friends, where like the main female character will just like not eat because she's so busy studying and like her mind is so powerful, she doesn't need to eat. I don't know, it's like a weird thing with food. I know there's been like think pieces written about that. I won't go too much into that now, but when I read it the first time, I was kind of like, that's kind of weird and just not really addressed in a meaningful way. But again, when I reread, I'm gonna pay attention to those details and see like maybe there's stuff that I didn't pick up on. And finally, I did not particularly enjoy the ending. I felt like it was kind of like a letdown after this entire like years of buildup. But I have to say that the ending did stick with me, even though I didn't like it or thought I didn't like it. I did mention this in my Intermezzo vlog where like the ending of that really came back to me is that line that Marianne thinks as she is talking to Connell. She's thinking like people really do change. And when you think about the story that way, about how these two people have helped each other change and grow, and it's not like just a romance, I think that there can be kind of more to enjoy there and more to take away. I think one thing that Normal People does really well is to illustrate how like class dynamic, how unintentionally you can play into those dynamics without really realizing it. And I think it also demonstrates a way that people can actually subvert expectations and roles in interpersonal dynamics. I know that the first time I read it in like 2 days because this is an immensely readable book. So I think I'm gonna try to read it more slowly and try to pick up on more things this time around. I'm gonna be doing reviews with the spoilers and without. So I'm gonna do the parts without spoilers first. I'm gonna mark those. Just make sure you're paying attention if you don't want spoilers. Review it, Kiwi? Yeah? No. I finished the first few chapters, the part where they're in high school, pretty quickly. This book is like all dialogue, so it goes by really fast. But already there are things that I am seeing differently. I think when I read it the first time, I was so, like, I really did not like Connell. I thought he was one, a loser, because he cares so much about what other people think, and like he just treated Marianne pretty badly in the beginning. And two, I didn't feel like he liked her as much as she liked him. But as I'm rereading it, I'm like, oh, he's down bad. He's just so deeply in denial about it and afraid of his feelings for her, because of caring about what other people think. I think they're like 18 or something like that. They're very young, they act very young, the dialogue reads young, and even though they're like beginning to have these more adult relationships, they're beginning to have sex, they're still very much figuring things out and learning that they have the power to hurt other people. When you're a young adult, like your brain hasn't developed all the way yet, you haven't had that much practice with real life relationships and other people. I think a lot of young people don't realize how much power they have over others. And I think we see this a lot in both Connell and Marianne. There are instances where each of the characters will say or do something, and then the other character is like, hey, you can't do that, like that's not okay. Like in the very beginning when Marianne just points out that Connell is blushing, he blushes all the time. And he's like, why do you have to be so harsh on people? Marianne says, I don't care, I won't tell anyone. And then Connell says, just because you won't tell people doesn't mean you can say whatever you want. And she says, okay, sorry. And it's just like little interactions like that that I think happen a lot when you're younger. If it happens in a healthy, communicative way, then those interactions really help you become a better person and to treat people better. And as I'm rereading this now as someone much older than the first time I read the book and someone much older than the characters in the book, I feel like I have so much more grace for the characters for acting really dumb and hurting each other so much, because people are so imperfect. Like, if I look back my own life, have I done really shitty and stupid things that like in the end I shouldn't have done, and like I hurt people for no reason? Yes, yeah. I feel like maybe I judged Connell a bit harshly when I read the book at first, and now I can be like, yeah, he was just kind of a dumb teenager and he's not a bad person. And I think that is the point of the book as a whole, is like neither of these characters are bad people, even though they're not perfect and they do mess up a lot and they are frustrating. But when you get to the end, they do change and they do grow. Of course, it remains to be seen how much I enjoy their growth and what I think of it at the end. But I feel like I'm already reading it more generously towards the characters because they do read so young to me. So I do want to talk specifically about some parts of the book and some quotes. So I'm gonna mark this as the beginning of the spoiler section for this like high school part of the book. So the first thing I want to talk about is how there is this mutual feeling between the two characters of like whatever happens between them stays between them, and that is a very freeing dynamic that they have. So this is a quote from page 21. With Marianne, it was different because everything was between them only, even awkward or difficult things. I found this interesting because when I read it the first time, I was thinking of their secret relationship as something that really only benefited Connell and was only something that was out of shame. And I think when I'm rereading it now, I'm seeing it as like it's actually so freeing for both of them. And with Connell, even though a lot of it is because he is ashamed, he is also in admiration of Marianne because she doesn't operate like that. Like, she is already ostracized by other people, so she doesn't seek their validation. And because of that, she's actually more free than he is. So that's a big theme in how he sees Marianne. On page 25, he says, Marianne lived a drastically free life. He was trapped by various considerations. He cared what people thought of him. He even cared what Marianne thought. That was obvious now. And then the book goes into this really long paragraph, like this long, where Connell, he is writing about Marianne in his journal. Multiple times he has tried writing his thoughts about Marianne down on paper.
He's moved by a desire to describe in words exactly how she looks and speaks, her hair and clothing, the copy of Swan's the way she reads at lunchtime, her long fingers turning the pages.
He's basically obsessed with her. Like, he's constantly thinking about her, and not just about how she looks or like the sexual attraction between them, but like how her mind works. There's this part where he says, if he silently decides not to say something when they're talking, Marianne will ask what. This what question seems to him to contain so much, not just the forensic attentiveness to his silences that allows her to ask in the first place, but a desire for total communication, a sense that anything unsaid is an unwelcome interruption between them. He's reading all that from her saying, what? I don't actually remember him being this down bad the first time I read it. Oh, I also forgot that like Connell and Marianne literally flirt over him telling her to read the Communist Manifesto. He's like, I'll write down the name for you. And she's like, I'll remember the Communist Manifesto. It's so funny to me reading this now because I'm like, oh, he is clearly infatuated with her. He is in love with her. And he is in such denial about it. I think the denial comes across very strongly in these first few chapters, especially like the way he tries to act so distant to her when they're like hanging out in person, when they're having sex, all of that. So I feel like when I read it the first time, I was reading more into his actions, and this time I am seeing his interiority and finding that very beautiful. It does make him more sympathetic of a character to me now. I think also after reading Intermezzo, where Rooney wrote two male main characters and we were in their heads so much, I think now reading Connell's POV here, I feel like I'm kind of able to just like appreciate how she writes men, and to appreciate like she never writes men as perfect, and women as well. She doesn't write anyone as perfect. Her books, although you could read them as like romance novels because romance is such a big part of it, it doesn't necessarily follow like the same conventions as a romance novel, where in romance novels a lot of it is the fantasy of wanting to be so bought into the love interest. I think also with more contemporary romance novels, there is more of a tendency to feel like the love interest has to be not like perfect, but like basically perfect. I feel like I am like guilty of this too, like very, very guilty of this too. But I'm trying to be more expansive in my reading, especially because when you read like older romance novels, the men are typically very flawed. And I think we've moved away from that for various like societal reasons. And I think in general, like probably that's a good thing. But I also feel like sometimes it can be a little too idealized. Not at all in the same vein as like, oh, they're giving women unrealistic expectations, because like, no. But I do feel like there is merit in having these male main characters who are very flawed in a way that is true to real life, while also demonstrating that they can grow from it. Like, yes, Connell has these issues, partly because, you know, toxic masculinity, but then he does learn from his mistakes. I do appreciate that. I'm trying to appreciate that more. And I guess to have like more patience for these fictional characters, which also makes me think about like reading Rooney's novels from like an abolitionist point of view, like this idea that human beings are redeemable and that they're not disposable because they've made a mistake, even if the mistake is pretty bad. I don't know, I just really appreciate how she always has maybe not even forgiveness, but like grace and like lack of judgment for her characters, even when they do pretty shitty things, or things that would be construed as shitty by like conventional morality. But maybe in her novels it's not quite so shitty. Like when she writes about infidelity in conversations with friends, that is a very gray area that she explores, and none of the characters are really judged to be bad people because of it. It's a very nuanced topic that she explores. I mean, obviously controversial, but I do think that she is doing something interesting with that. Another thing I remember not enjoying the first time I read it was that I felt like the characters' backgrounds, especially Marianne's and her family abuse, I found that not as fleshed out as I wanted, but upon the reread, I feel like there's actually a lot there that maybe I missed the first time I read it. In particular, there is that one chapter where her brother Alan is basically physically abusive towards her, but it's written in such a way that when he is abusive, she dissociates. Alan makes a fist with his left hand. It doesn't matter, it's over. And then it goes into Marianne's interior monologue where she's just thinking about walking around the neighborhood and how beautiful it is. And then it kind of like zooms back out. And then there's this sentence later on where it says that her mom decided a long time ago that it is acceptable for men to use aggression towards Marianne as a way of expressing themselves. As a child, Marianne resisted, but now she simply detaches, as if it isn't of any interest to her, which in a way it isn't. So it's pretty much implied that her brother just hits her instead of fighting back, because she's learned that she can't. She just goes into herself, which is like, it's actually like really fucking sad. I feel like I totally did not get that the first time I read it, maybe because I read it in kind of like a fever state in 2 days. That's like a pretty big thing to miss. So I'm starting to feel like I did not read it very closely the first time, and I'm glad I'm rereading it. There's also this other quote on page 44 where after Connell tells her that he loves her. And this is after he basically rescues her from a situation where she is sexually assaulted at this bar. And he basically takes her side amongst his friend group. This is like the one redeeming thing that he does when they're in high school. After he tells her he loves her, she has never believed herself fit to be loved by any person, but now she has a new life, of which this is the first moment. And even after many years have passed, she will still think, yes, that was it, the beginning of my life. It's so good. I think when I read it the first time, I was kind of like, girl, stand up. And now that I'm rereading it, I'm like, no, actually, she's so right for that. That's really beautiful. It's like, yes, Connell is very deeply flawed. Yes, he treats her quite badly, but also, can we still gain something from the experience of being loved and experiencing love, even when it is deeply imperfect? And I think so. I think we can. I think that there can be redeeming qualities about a relationship like this. I think that love, even if it is flawed, can help us grow and to help us love ourselves as well. I think maybe I've become less cynical when it comes to love, which is like kind of a really nice thing. I feel like that maybe doesn't always happen to people as they get older. Another thing that I really enjoyed was Connell's mom, Lorraine. She is Marianne's biggest fan. Also because she is like the only really like adult voice that we're hearing in these first few chapters. She is the voice of reason, and she is telling Connell like, you need to treat her better. You are being so foolish. And like literally no one's gonna care about the fact that she's not popular in school. Like, Connell, what are you doing? I also just really liked her and Connell's relationship as mother and son, because she was a single mom. She had him very young. I think when she was like 15 or 16. He calls her by first name. They have such a close and transparent relationship that is quite refreshing to read, especially when you contrast it to Marianne's horrible relationship with her parents and her family. Last thing I'll talk about is the actual writing structure and style. So I was not a huge fan of the third person present tense when I read it the first time. Still not a huge fan of it, but I do like what she does. I don't think I realized the first time like how structured this book is. So every chapter opens in the present tense. It throws you into the perspective of the character who's narrating, or whose perspective you're in. And then it very quickly goes into a flashback where it kind of catches you up to the present moment, and then it resumes the present moment. So every chapter follows that structure, which I really enjoy. Even though the narrative is linear, it is told in a non-linear way in a way. And there are time skips between each chapter that vary from like 2 days to like 3 months. And so you are seeing very select parts of their relationship and their interactions with each other. But interestingly, a lot of these very important moments, like the first time they kiss, first time they have sex, happen in the flashback. I wonder why, because those would be such interesting scenes to explore in the present tense, or like as they're happening in the book. But then I also feel like it brings another level of depth to the novel to have it happen in the flashback. It is this idea of, you know, this shared history between the two characters, and this shared history is how they get from one point in their relationship to another point. I was texting my best friend about this, and Normal People was my least favorite Sally Rooney book for a very, very long time. And she was like, watch it become your favorite. But I could see this maybe even becoming more of a favorite than like Conversations with Friends, because I feel like it deals with a lot of the same themes, but maybe in a more mature way. We'll see. We will see. If you have like a ranking of your favorite Rooney novels, let me know. I would love to know what yours are. Everyone I feel like has a different ranking, and that's so interesting. All right, enough yapping for now. I will go ahead and read the next few chapters when they are in college, before Marianne goes abroad. That will be part 2. So I said I was going to finish up to the part where Marianne goes abroad, but there's too much that's happened that I want to talk about, so I'm just gonna stop here and talk to you. So I read from page 66, which is when I start going to college, to page 135. So I'm gonna give like a very basic, spoiler-free review of this part here. I'm now realizing that when I read this the first time, I don't think I understood the relationship very well. Now that I'm reading it, it has much more of an emotional impact. I feel like the relationship between Connell and Marianne, the way it's portrayed in this book, is one of soulmates. The only thing is that because they come from very different class backgrounds, there's a lot of different factors at play that influence how they grow up and how they view the world and relationships. That makes it very difficult for them to be together. I think the first time I read it, I was more caught up in the idea of like, why are they miscommunicating so much when a lot of their issues could be just solved by communicating? But now that I have matured a bit, it's really easy to be like, oh, these characters should just communicate. But in real life, like how many times have things fallen apart because it was difficult to communicate? And everyone is coming from these different contexts where, you know, maybe communication is not always safe, especially when it comes to certain issues. I think in the end, the conflict that arises between Connell and Marianne that drives them apart is very realistic, considering who they are and their backgrounds and how they have been raised to view certain aspects of relationships. I think there's also a lot in here about how loving someone or someone loving you gives you power over them and vice versa, and how that power can obviously be abused, but it can also not be, and it can be a very positive thing. And there's examples of both in here as well. But there's so much to talk about with like really specific examples, so I'm gonna go into like the spoiler part now. When Connell and Marianne go to college, they enter this completely different dynamic where now Connell feels like the odd one out and Marianne has all of these friends. She's super popular because she is just more at home and more comfortable with people from wealthy backgrounds, and now all of the things that made her kind of a pariah in high school are now making her cool in college. So it's a completely inverted power dynamic. I think with Connell's perspective, there's a really great description of how it feels to be suddenly thrust into this world where everyone has so much more wealth privilege than you do. He understands now that his classmates are not like him. It's easy for them to have opinions and to express them with confidence. They don't worry about appearing ignorant or conceited. They are not stupid people, but they're not so much smarter than him either. They just move through the world in a different way, and he'll probably never really understand them, and he knows they will never understand him or even try. So we do see the repercussions of how he treated Marianne. He basically feels super shitty about it. He enters a deep depression, and then something happens with his high school friends where it turns out they kind of knew all along that he and Marianne were together anyway in secret. He realizes that no one even cared. They treated him the same way, and they could have been together. He didn't have to hurt her, and they could have been happy. So he realizes that it's all in his head, and this completely fucks him up. Anyway, he goes to this party in college where he doesn't know anyone, and the guy who brings him is like, let me introduce you to my girlfriend. And guess who it is? It's Marianne. And he basically sees her looking really hot, surrounded by all these people, and it's just a complete 180 from their situations back at home. This is where the classic line from the Hulu show comes from, where he says, "You look really well," and she says, "I know, it's classic me. I came to college and got pretty." Just imagine that in an Irish accent. But they reconnect. She greets him like they're old friends, and she's just extremely gracious about everything. And at this point, because Connell has grown up a bit and has left this like cloistered environment of where they are from, he's been out in the world a bit more. He understands that all of these things that he used to find like super important and dramatic are actually not that important in the grand scheme of things. And Connell kind of integrates into Marianne's friend group, which is pretty wealthy and privileged just like her. He's only tolerated because she likes him. And a lot of her female friends do like him as well, but they also exercise their class privilege in ways that are really, they don't even realize they're doing it, but it's very harmful. They'll make comments about like how he dresses and say like, well, his clothes are really cheap. So Marianne will have these moments of dissonance where she's like, this is not right. There are moments where she doesn't really know what to do and how to intervene, but then there are moments where she can very easily intervene, and she does, and challenges these dynamics that happen in her friend group, which I think is an interesting way to show like this imperfect solidarity that you can have with people who don't have the same privilege as you in these everyday social situations. For example, Marianne's male friends don't like Connell because they all want to fuck Marianne too. All of her male friends are like, well, Connell's not even that smart. Marianne will always say he's smarter than I am. And Marianne also has somewhat of an understanding that the reason why people treat him differently is because he is from a working class background. That being said, her understanding of their class differences and how that affects their lifestyles and where they come from is also very imperfect, and we'll get to that later. So at one point, Connell does apologize to Marianne. He said, I'm still thinking about it a lot, why I acted in such a fucked up way. She squeezed his hand and he squeezed back so tightly it almost hurt her, and this small gesture of desperation on his part made her smile. So they have this really sweet moment where he basically is like, if I changed and became a better person, it's because of you. And then she forgives him for what he did to her in high school. The way their physical relationship is written, there's a lot of references to religion and spirituality. When he touches her again for like the first time in a year, it says she feels holy like a shrine. It's really, really beautiful. There's also a line when he sees Marianne at her father's mass and he thinks she looks like a religious art. And he's not a religious person. And after reading Intermezzo, where there was a lot of thought about religion and spirituality, but with none of the characters actually being like devoutly religious, I found that really interesting as well. This connection between religion and like a higher order to very kind of like basic human desires and relationships. There's also another beautiful line on page 97 which likens Connell and Marianne's conversation to them being figure skaters. She tosses herself gracefully into the air, and each time, without knowing how he's gonna do it, he catches her. And it's also kind of like a metaphor for their entire relationship and their innate understanding of each other. Another thing I want to talk about is this idea that loving someone and them loving you gives you power over them. These are two scenes that Sally Rooney writes right next to each other. In one scene, he makes her happy when she's feeling down, and it's something very easy for him, and he realizes it's within his power to make her happy. It was something he could just give to her, like money or sex. And then in the very next scene, he has a terrible sense all of a sudden that he could hit her face very hard even, and she would just sit there and let him. And this scares him so bad that he's almost like, I have to leave the room. But I thought it was interesting to have these two scenes next to each other and to show that there's two sides of the coin with love, and also that this power exists whether someone abuses it or not. And I think knowing what happens next, it does set up the next part of the book in an interesting way. The next part is the most frustrating part for me to read, and I think a lot of people as well, and it is when they break up. It is frustrating because it entirely boils down to miscommunication, and a lot of people hate this, and I think when I read it, I hated it as well. But the way it's written in Normal People specifically, I really feel like it does make a lot of sense for the characters, and it does illustrate why it's so difficult for them to be together, how their backgrounds have influenced like how they see each other and themselves. They're at Trinity together, they are for all intents and purposes together. And then it's time for the summer break, and Connell, who has been working this job to basically pay rent for all of school, which Marianne doesn't have to do. She has this apartment that is her grandmother's that she just gets to live in for free. But Connell has to work for rent, and his job cuts back his hours, so he can't afford rent, basically. And prior to this, they never talked about money, which is kind of ironic considering how they even know each other in the first place. So he knows that he could just ask her to stay in her apartment over the summer, and he knows that she would say yes. But he just can't bring himself to do it because it feels too much like asking her for money. And not only is he ashamed of asking her for money, but he feels afraid of losing her, because to him, this illustrates that he doesn't belong in her world and he never can. So when he finally, at the very last minute, tells her, I can't afford the rent in my apartment, the conversation totally goes sideways. And the thing about Marianne is that she is coming from this context of having this family background that is very unloving. I think she has a lot of rejection trauma, and so when he says, I can't afford the rent in my apartment, she just shuts down and thinks he's leaving me. Like, she thinks it's like an excuse for him to leave her for the summer. It's just so painful to read because you know that neither of them wants this to happen. I do have to give a shout out to Lorraine, Connell's mother, because she is constantly like the voice of reason for these two idiot teenagers. So Connell's like, Marianne would never go out with someone like me, like I don't belong in her world. And Lorraine's like, I don't actually think she's that kind of person. And Connell's like, well, I can only tell you what happened. Lorraine says, maybe you're misinterpreting what happened. Lorraine is all of us being like, you guys just get together, please. There is also a little bit setting up like Marianne's kinks. So she admits that her new boyfriend hits her during sex, but that it's something that she asked him to do, and she doesn't even enjoy it, but she just wanted to, you know, be the submissive one. I know the first time I read this, I really did not like the portrayal, but I feel like because I'm reading it with such like a more of an open mind, I am interested to see how this goes. So Marianne's trying to explain this kink to Connell, and she says, it's not that I get off on being degraded as such. I just like to know that I would degrade myself for someone if they wanted me to. It's about the dynamic more than what actually happens. Maybe I want to be treated badly. Sometimes I think I deserve bad things because I'm a bad person. I guess I have a lot of conflicting feelings about this still, and I'm gonna try to unpack it more as I keep reading. But then when she contrasts it with her relationship with Connell, she says, I didn't need to play any games with you, it was real. With you, that really was a dynamic. I actually had those feelings. I would have done anything you wanted me to. I think it is really interesting how we are seeing this contrast between Marianne having this unhealthy relationship where she like wants so bad for that to be the case, and then this relationship with Connell where it actually was the case and she felt actually very safe with him because she knew that he would never exercise that power in an abusive way. I think in each novel, Rooney has basically argued that love is not separate from material reality. In fact, it must exist within and often is a factor of material realities. I do think Normal People illustrates this much more directly than her other novels, perhaps. I'm gonna keep reading. I am a little anxious about the next parts because they're not together and they're dating different people and I don't like it. Talk to you soon. It's been like 2 weeks since I filmed the last part. You can tell because my nails are busted and they're different from last time. I am almost done. So I have been reading, I just haven't been filming it. I think I have like oh my god, yeah, I have like one chapter left because this part is actually an excerpt from Beautiful World. I really only have like 10 pages left. I'm gonna finish it up and then I'm gonna give my final thoughts on the book. I just finished. Obviously I cried. I wasn't expecting to. I think I do find Normal People to be her saddest book. I don't know, I feel like the other novels, especially like Beautiful World, you had that epilogue, and with Intermezzo there was a lot of loose ends tied up. With Normal People, it's so open-ended. I'm not going to be able to talk about this part without spoilers, I think. I will say that a lot of my initial perspectives from the first time I read it did change. In particular, my view of the relationship between Connell and Marianne. I remember the first time I was like, what is even the point? Like, he treated her so poorly. And this time when I read it, I felt that there was this special connection between them that defied conventions. It seems like really obvious now saying it out loud that this is what the book is about, but I think the first time I read it, I was a lot younger and a lot dumber. Maybe the first time I read it, because I did think about the book a lot. Like, I have been thinking about it up until this point, which is why I decided to reread it. So I feel like maybe, some of that did speak to me, but not fully. So an argument for rereading for sure. Very surface level, I do want to say that the initial reasons I didn't like normal people, I think most of them I have changed my mind about. I remember like one of the things I really hated was like the depiction of how Marianne like never eats, and it's something that happens in like conversations with friends as well, but isn't really addressed as an eating disorder. Whereas I think in normal people, upon this reread, it is very, very clear that it is a self-sabotaging behavior by Marianne, and it's something that's kind of like her parallel to Connell's mental illness. Another thing was the depiction of the kink and intimacy. I am still conflicted, and I think I will talk about that more in the spoiler part of the review. The first time I really did not like the ending. I'm still conflicted, but I think the way it ended makes a lot of sense for the themes of the book. And that's all I'm gonna say for this part of the review to avoid spoilers. But now we can really talk. So if you haven't read it yet, go read it, come back, and let's chat. So this last part of the novel is the darkest part because it goes through mental illness, abuse, and just like really terrible things that happen. Last time I stopped at a point where they break up. They do clear up this miscommunication, but at this point it's like too late. Marianne has another boyfriend who is like really evil, physically abuses her, and they have like abusive sex basically. There's that whole aspect, which I want to unpack. But then there's also the aspect of Connell getting a girlfriend. This girlfriend is like extremely normal. So Connell goes in this very conventional relationship direction, which makes him feel normal, makes him feel like he has a place in the world. And Marianne goes in this other direction, which feels a lot more like self-sabotaging. And they are still in each other's lives. They have a very special friendship, even if it's not romantically linked, but they also still have this attraction for each other, which would make it awful for like the other people they're involved in if they weren't so annoying and unlikable, and in Jamie's case, which is Marianne's boyfriend, like downright evil. So it's fine, like I don't really care about them. This part also digs a lot more into their class differences and how there are more subtle ways that this difference plays out. For example, there's a scholarship that they both test for, and for Marianne and her privileged friends is just a way to show status, and like if someone doesn't get it then it's embarrassing. And for Connell, if he doesn't get it, then he literally can't afford like tuition and room and board. That disconnect is something that like I think they do kind of talk about, but there are issues like that where even though Marianne is to some extent like pretty aware of her class privilege when it comes to Connell, she still has these spots where, she doesn't think about it. There's also this other thread where Connell thinks that Marianne is damaged or broken, like he thinks of her in those terms, and when he's with Helen, his new girlfriend, who is totally normal, I guess she doesn't have trauma or whatever, he's like, oh, I'm not damaged, I'm not broken, she just made me feel that way. Marianne and him have this heart-to-heart after her boyfriend pisses her off and is just a total jerk as usual. And Marianne confesses that she thinks something's wrong with her. She thinks that she's damaged and broken. I don't know why I can't make people love me. I think there was something wrong with me when I was born. And this is the first time that she confesses to Connell that her family is like straight up abusive. Like they physically hurt her, her mom doesn't stand up for her, and he never knew this before. He asked, why didn't you tell me? And she said, well, I thought you wouldn't want me anymore. This is one of the turning points of their relationship where Connell actually fully sees her, I think, and realizes he was engaging in this really fucked up way of thinking. Ironically, once he does find out what it is that is wrong with her, he realizes that there actually isn't anything wrong with her, it's just trauma. But time moves on, Marianne goes to study abroad in Sweden, and she gets into this relationship with this Swedish guy. So this guy that she's seeing is very into kink, very like degradation, humiliation focused. Kind of unclear that this is what Marianne is actually into. It's something that gets her off, but she feels really bad about it. Probably because she's doing it with these guys that like genuinely believe these things about her. And I think the book does show that it is different when it's with Connell, but I'm still unclear how I feel about the kink depiction in this book, because with Connell it's like this idea of submission, but he doesn't degrade her, which kind of makes me think about like, what is the book really saying about people who do have like a degradation kink, which is like, that's your thing, that's totally fine. You know what's actually really funny is that I'm also reading Deep End by Ali Hazelwood right now, and the guy is named Lucas and he is Swedish, and Marianne's Swedish lover is also named Lucas, and they also say the same line about like, oh, there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothes. Is that just like a really stereotypically Swedish thing to say? Because like, why has it happened in 2 books that I've read already? So Lucas tells her that he loves her, and Marianne totally freaks out. She's like, could he really do the gruesome things he does to her and believe at the same time that he's acting out of love? Is the world such an evil place that love should be indistinguishable from the basest and most abusive forms of violence? I was like, but you're asking him to do those things. I do think she was using her sexuality and her sexual preferences as a way to self-harm, the same way like she's using this eating disorder to self-harm, and her relationships with people who don't even like her to self-harm. Like, I think it's a pattern here. And I also think like in real life, your preferences, all of that can be very nuanced and complicated, and it doesn't have to be like, oh, kink is never bad and never harmful to people, especially if it's like practiced in a way that, like for example, Marianne is not all knowledgeable about this stuff. I don't think she's like very keyed into like safe BDSM practices or consent or that kind of thing. I think she really is using it to self-harm with the 2 relationships in this book who are not Connell. But I do think that is different from like tying it to her trauma and saying like, oh, this is why she has those preferences. A lot of times people do use kink as a way to fulfill these psychological needs, which could be from trauma, but they also could just be from like being a person in this world that has certain demands of you. So I don't know. Like, I do think it is interesting to think about how Marianne suffers physical abuse from her family and then asks these men who do not respect her to hurt her. She also asked Connell to hurt her at one point, which we will get to, and I want to talk about that as well. On the other hand, she has this very organic sexual relationship with Connell that is subversive and kinky just naturally. Next, the book dives more into Connell's mental illness. He sinks into a deep depression and starts going to therapy. The main big thing is that one of his friends from school, who Marianne also knew, Rob, commits suicide. Another thing that happens is that his girlfriend and him break up. The girlfriend could sense that he and Marianne definitely had this relationship. It was just something that she was not part of. Can't blame her. Like, she sensed that she was actually the other woman and she pieced out. He and Marianne kind of reconnect after this happens. I also want to add here that the characters literally go to a protest against the war in Gaza. That's what the book says. So Marianne goes with Connell and Niall? I looked this up. I think it's Niall. Okay, so Marianne goes to a protest with Connell and Niall. And Niall is depicted as like a pretty good friend to Connell. He's the one who suggested that Connell go and seek therapy. He also like stands up to an instance of like casual racism against Asians that Jamie, the evil ex, brought up. So I love Niall. I think he's like the best side character. Like, he's just like protesting for Palestine. He's standing up against Asian hate. Yeah, love him. Connell basically says that his entire life up until this point is because of Marianne. It's funny the decisions you make because you like someone and then your whole life is different. And then this is the scene that I'm still kind of unpacking it. So they start having sex and it's great, and then Marianne asks him to hit her and Connell kind of freaks out. This is very like unnegotiated kink. Like, they didn't talk about this before. They're in the moment and Marianne's like, can you hit me? And he's like, I don't think I want to do that, which like, fair. And it's not really ever explained why she wants him to hit her. I almost wonder if it's like she knows that it wouldn't really hurt her. It kind of makes them stop the whole thing. Marianne goes home and they both feel like they fucked up somehow. It's like a throwaway line, but like it's revealed later that Connell, after she leaves, is just like crying in his room alone. This is such like an early 20s thing to do, where like something unexpected or really awkward or whatever happens during sex, and then you both are like, I have to go. And then you go and like cry alone. It's not funny, but it kind of kind of is. Then after this, Marianne goes home and her brother, they get into an altercation and her brother like pushes into her bedroom door, but her face is right against the door, so he basically breaks her nose, and then she calls Connell because she doesn't know who else to call, and Connell comes to her rescue. I think this is such an impactful moment because this is the first time that anyone has ever stood up for Marianne against her abusive family. No one's ever done this for her. Connell literally drives to her house, he confronts her brother, and he tells her brother, if you ever touch Marianne again, I'll kill you. I texted my best friend and I was like, touch her and you die trope. I'm sorry, but anyway. And after this, he tells Marianne, everything's going to be alright, trust me, I love you, I'm not going to let anything like that happen to you again. He's given her this, which is the feeling of safety and protection and love. And you know, before this, she's only experienced like her family's version of love, if you can call it that. So Connell and Marianne are in a relationship again. It was kind of like their relationship in like the middle of the book. They don't have labels. I don't know why they aren't just like boyfriend, girlfriend. Are they like too cool for that? I'm probably missing the point of the book again as I say that. He knew how to give her what she wanted, to leave her open, weak, powerless, sometimes crying. He understood that it wasn't necessary to hurt her. He could let her submit willingly without violence. I feel like what it's implying is that what Marianne really wanted was to feel like complete powerlessness and submission to someone else. And because of her upbringing, she thought that the only way to do that was through being like physically assaulted, which is why she would ask her sexual partners to hit her. So that's what I'm reading from this line. I would love to know if you have a different interpretation. I thought before like it was totally shaming like the way that she wanted to have sex and attributing it to her trauma versus like, it's like she has these sexual preferences no matter what, but because of her trauma, she was seeking to fulfill it in ways that were ultimately harmful to her. And with Connell, because he is ultimately a good person, she's able to find sexual fulfillment without it actually harming her in a way that replicates the patterns of abuse that she's had. She's spending Christmas with his family instead of with her family, which was always like, she was always scared to go home to her family for the holidays. They even go out to a New Year's thing with their old school friends, or for Marianne, they're not really her friends, they were like her old bullies. But at this point, everyone has chilled out, they're nice to Marianne. Like, you know how when you're younger, you can be kind of a little shit, and then you grow up and you're like, oh, I was a little shit? That's what happened to half the population of this little Irish town. When they do the countdown, Connell kisses her in front of all these people. It's like this full circle moment where they began this relationship in secret because he was too ashamed for people to know that he was with her, and now he's kissing her in front of everyone and everyone knows they're together and nothing bad's happening. They all think it's cool. I love this line. She was in his power. He had chosen to redeem her. She was redeemed. It does feel like their relationship gets to a pretty like healthy place at this point, which is what makes the next part so upsetting. Connell gets an email that he got accepted into this MFA program in New York. He is basically like, I love you. If you want me to stay, I'll stay. And Marianne's thinking he might not come back, or when he comes back, he'll be different. What they have now, they can never have back again. But for her, the pain of loneliness will be nothing to the pain that she used to feel of being unworthy. He brought her goodness like a gift, and now it belongs to her. So the first time I read this book, I wanted to hurl the book across the room because I was like, all of that, all of this, for that? And they're not even together? I was so mad. You know, rereading it now, I'm still upset they're not like together forever. But I also know that that is not the point of the book. I think it is like very fitting with the theme and with the characters themselves. Of course, Marianne is going to tell Connell to do whatever she thinks is best for him because she loves him so much and she really believes in him. And initially when I first read it, I understood that part, but then I felt like Connell didn't do enough for her. But you know, rereading it, the way he like stood up for her family and created this like safe place for her, like showed her what love is without abuse, like that in itself is really beautiful. It's like the book says, he brought her goodness like a gift and now it belongs to her. How do you measure what someone does for you if it's something like, he brought her goodness like a gift and now it belongs to her? And also I think like the impulse to have a kind of like perfectly balanced relationship where like each person is giving the same amount, like how do you even measure that to begin with? And that's also just a very childish way to view relationships. So I understand the ending. I understand why it had to be that way. Doesn't mean I am happy with it. No, I am not happy with it. I want them to be together. Would like Sally Rooney to write an epilogue where they end up together like 10 years down the line. Give us their happy ending. If I had to rank which of her books I like the most now, I'm not even sure where this would fall anymore. Like, would it be my most favorite? I'm not even sure. It might actually not be my most favorite just because I'm still upset at the ending. Villain origin story. I'm still mad. If you've read it and you liked it, please, please, please let me know what you thought. Like, what were your favorite parts? I just need to like talk to people about this. I feel like there's so many like unresolved thoughts I have about the book. And if you didn't like it, also let me know, because I'm curious if you had the same reasons that I did, and if you've ever like changed your mind, if you've reread it and were like, actually, I like how it approaches these topics now, which I never would have thought would happen to me. The book is the same. I'm the thing that's different. It just proves the end of the book. People can really change one another. Thank you so much for watching, and please let me know your thoughts if you've read it. I will talk to you later.